Here's something nobody ever asks. We talk about when humans discovered fire. We talk about when humans invented the wheel. We talk about the first tools, the first art, the first cities, the first writing. But nobody asks, when did humans first decide to take a burning plant, put it in their mouth, and inhale? Because that's weird, right? Like, objectively, if you think about it from first principles, you see something on fire, your every survival instinct says, get away from it. And yet at some point, some human being looked at a burning plant and thought, what if I just breathed that in? What if I put my face right next to the thing that's on fire and sucked? And then they did it. And then they told their friends. And now, thousands of years later, smoking is one of the most widespread human behaviors on the planet. So when did this start? Who started it? And why on earth did it catch on? The answer is going to take us from prehistoric campfires to ancient shamans to the Mayan jungle to Ottoman coffee houses to the tobacco plantations that literally reshaped the modern world. And by the end of it, you are going to understand something about human behavior that most people never stop to think about. Let's get into it. Before we talk about smoking specifically, we need to talk about fire, because you cannot have one without the other, and the relationship between humans and fire is even older and stranger than most people realize. The earliest solid evidence of humans deliberately using and controlling fire dates back roughly 1.5 million years at a site in South Africa called Wonderwork Cave. That's not Homo sapiens. That's Homo erectus, our evolutionary predecessor. A species that walked upright, used tools, and apparently discovered that fire was extremely useful for staying warm, for scaring away predators, and for cooking food. And here's the thing about cooking with fire. It produces smoke. A lot of smoke. If you are sitting around a fire, roasting meat, preparing food, you are inhaling smoke. Not intentionally. Not because you enjoy it, but because it's unavoidable. For hundreds of thousands of years, smoke was simply a byproduct of survival. It was the smell of warmth, of food, of safety. Our brains were literally shaped in the presence of fire smoke. We are, in a very real evolutionary sense, adapted to it in ways that other animals are not. Researchers have actually found that humans have unique genetic variants in the AHR gene, the aryl hydrocarbon receptor gene, that make us significantly more tolerant of the toxic compounds in smoke than other primates. Chimpanzees, our closest living relatives, exposed to smoke show immediate distress responses. Humans, by contrast, can tolerate much higher levels without acute reaction. Why? Because we spent hundreds of thousands of generations sitting around fires. The individuals who couldn't handle smoke died, or were less productive. The ones who could handle it thrived. Natural selection, over an enormous span of time, quietly gave us a biological tolerance for smoke that we didn't ask for but absolutely received. So when humans eventually started smoking intentionally, they weren't doing something completely alien to their biology. They were taking something their bodies had already been adapted to, involuntary smoke inhalation, and making it deliberate, making it purposeful. That shift from accidental inhalation to intentional smoking is one of the most interesting transitions in human history. And it happened in a very specific context. It happened almost certainly in the context of ritual. Here's why that matters. The early intentional use of smoke by humans wasn't about pleasure. It wasn't about addiction. It wasn't about habit. It was about reaching somewhere else, about altered states, about communication with forces that couldn't be reached through ordinary consciousness. Across virtually every ancient culture that has been studied, archaeologists find the same pattern. The burning of aromatic plants in sacred, ceremonial, or ritualistic contexts. Not eaten, not drunk. Burned. And the smoke inhaled, breathed in, allowed to fill a space, used as an offering or a vehicle. The ancient Egyptians burned kaifi, a complex aromatic blend made from ingredients including juniper, myrrh, frankincense, and various resins, in temple rituals. The exact recipe varied, but the purpose was consistent. The smoke was a thasha medium, a way of sending something upward to the gods. The word perfume itself comes from the Latin perfumum, through smoke. In ancient Mesopotamia, the burning of aromatic materials was central to religious practice. Incense burned before statues of gods was understood as food for the divine. The gods consumed the smoke, were nourished by it, were pleased by it. If you wanted something from a god, you burned something nice. The smoke went up. The communication was made. In ancient China, ritual burning of plant materials appears in some of the oldest archaeological records of human ceremonial activity. Oracle bones, the ancient Chinese method of divination, were sometimes burned, and the smoke and resulting cracks were read for signs. Plant materials burned in ritual contexts appear throughout the archaeological record. The pattern is global and ancient and remarkably consistent. Humans discovered that burning certain plants produced aromatic smoke, that this smoke could produce mild physiological effects, relaxation, altered perception, heightened sensory awareness, and they interpreted these effects as spiritual, as meaningful, as access to something beyond the ordinary. This is how intentional smoking begins, not at a party, not out of boredom, in ceremony, in ritual, in the presence of the sacred. Now, there's a difference between burning aromatic plants and inhaling the smoke, and actually smoking, putting a plant material in your mouth in a pipe or other device and drawing the smoke directly into your lungs. And the evidence for that specific practice, that deliberate personal inhalation, becomes really compelling when we look at certain cultures in particular. One of the most ancient and well-documented smoking traditions in the world comes from the Americas, specifically from Mesoamerica, the region encompassing modern-day Mexico and Central America, and from the indigenous cultures of North America. Tobacco, specifically, is a plant native to the Americas, and its use there predates European contact by thousands of years. The earliest direct archaeological evidence for tobacco smoking comes from pipes and other smoking implements found across North America and Mesoamerica. Nicotine residue has been detected in ancient pipes from sites in Alabama dating back roughly 3,000 years, but there's indirect evidence suggesting tobacco use could be considerably older than that, and tobacco in its original indigenous context was not what it became after European colonization. It was not a casual recreational habit. It was profoundly sacred. Among many North American indigenous cultures, tobacco was considered one of the most sacred plants in existence, a gift from the Creator, a direct line of communication between the human and the divine. It was smoked in ceremony, offered to the earth before planting, blown to the four directions, shared in rituals of peace and diplomacy. The famous peace pipe, or calumet, was not just a symbol. It was a functioning piece of ritual technology. Sharing the smoke created a bond, an agreement witnessed by the spirits. The smoke was not just exhaled into the air, it was sent somewhere. It carried intention, prayer, communication upward and outward into the world of spirits and gods. In Mesoamerica, among the Maya, whose civilization reached its peak roughly 1,500 years ago but stretched back much further, tobacco appears prominently in art, mythology, and religious practice. Maya pottery from over 2,000 years ago depicts figures smoking what appear to be cigars. Rolled tobacco leaves. The Dresden Codex, one of the few surviving Maya books, contains images of gods smoking. Tobacco was offered to deities, used in ritual bloodletting ceremonies, and consumed by priests and shamans as part of spiritual practice. And the Maya weren't just smoking tobacco. Evidence suggests they were smoking other plant materials as well, including, intriguingly, cannabis-like substances, though this remains debated among researchers. What's clear is that the broader category of things you roll or pack and smoke was understood and practiced. The technology was there. The intent was sacred. Now here's something wild that deserves its own moment. In 2018, researchers analyzing residue in ceramic vessels found at a site in the American Southwest called Turkey Pen Ruin, occupied by ancestral Pueblo peoples over 1,000 years ago, detected the chemical signatures of tobacco. Not just any tobacco, but a specific wild variety that would have required the people there to either cultivate it themselves or trade for it across considerable distance, since wild tobacco doesn't naturally grow in that region. This tells us several things. First, that smoking was practiced far and wide across the pre-Columbian Americas, not just in the tropical regions where tobacco grows most readily. Second, that people were going out of their way to obtain tobacco, trading for it, perhaps cultivating it, which means it was valued highly enough to justify significant effort. Third, that the distribution networks for tobacco in the pre-Columbian Americas were extensive and well established. And this was all happening, remember, with no knowledge in the outside world that tobacco even existed. For the entirety of recorded human history in Europe, Asia, and Africa, all those thousands of years of Greek philosophy and Roman Empire and Chinese dynasties and Islamic Golden Age, tobacco was completely unknown. It didn't exist for them. The Americas had this entire smoking tradition, this deep and ancient relationship between humans and tobacco, and the rest of the world had no idea. Until 1492. And that's when everything changed. Christopher Columbus and his crew landing in the Caribbean were among the first Europeans to encounter tobacco. The indigenous Taino people of the islands smoked tobacco through Y-shaped tubes inserted in the nostrils, a practice that was apparently alarming enough that it was written about in detail. Columbus's crew brought back tobacco to Europe, and Europe, to put it mildly, was interested. Within decades, tobacco was being grown in Portugal and Spain. Within a century, it had spread across Europe, into the Ottoman Empire, into Africa, into Asia. The speed of this spread is almost hard to believe. We're talking about a completely new plant, a completely new practice, disseminating across the entire globe in roughly 100 years. Why so fast? Several reasons. First, tobacco works. Nicotine is a remarkably effective psychoactive compound. It produces alertness, focus, mild euphoria, and a sense of relaxation, while also being a potent appetite suppressant. In an era of hard physical labor and unreliable food supplies, those effects were not trivial. People felt better when they smoked. Noticeably, immediately better. Second, nicotine is addictive. Highly, ruthlessly addictive. Once people started, stopping was difficult. Demand was persistent and reliable in a way that most commodities simply weren't. Third, tobacco was actively promoted by merchants, by physicians, by explorers. In the early decades after its arrival in Europe, tobacco was marketed as a medicinal plant, a cure-all. Jean Nicot, the French ambassador whose name was immortalized in the word nicotine, promoted tobacco as a medicine in France in the 1560s, claiming it could treat everything from headaches to cancer. Physicians across Europe took up these claims enthusiastically because tobacco produced obvious physiological effects. And in an era before modern medicine, obvious physiological effects were usually interpreted as medicinal action. The first serious opposition came quickly. King James I of England published a pamphlet in 1604 called A Counterblast to Tobacco, arguably the world's first anti-smoking publication, in which he described smoking as a custom loathsome to the eye, hateful to the nose, harmful to the brain, dangerous to the lungs. He was correct on essentially all counts. He was ignored by almost everyone. The spread of tobacco globally in the 16th and 17th centuries is one of the most dramatic examples of cultural diffusion in history. And it was not gentle. The tobacco trade was built on slavery. The large-scale cultivation of tobacco in the American colonies, Virginia in particular, beginning in the early 1600s, required enormous amounts of labor. That labor was initially provided by indentured servants, but the economics of plantation agriculture drove colonial planters toward enslaved African labor. By the mid-17th century, tobacco plantations in Virginia and Maryland were operating on the labor of thousands of enslaved people. By the time the American Revolution occurred, the tobacco economy had become inseparably entangled with the institution of slavery. This is not a tangent. This is central to the story of smoking in the modern world. The reason tobacco became globally ubiquitous, the reason it was cheap enough and available enough to become a mass habit, is directly connected to one of the most brutal systems of human exploitation in history. The history of smoking is also the history of the Atlantic slave trade. You cannot fully understand one without acknowledging the other. As tobacco spread, so did other smoking practices. In the Middle East and North Africa, a different form of smoking emerged and became culturally dominant: the hookah, or water pipe. Dating in various forms to at least the 16th century, with some historical arguments placing earlier forms in India or Persia, the hookah filtered smoke through water before inhalation, producing a cooler, smoother experience. It became central to social life across a vast region, from Morocco to Iran to the Indian subcontinent. Coffee houses in Istanbul and Cairo featured hookah as a matter of course. It was social. It was leisurely. It was woven into the fabric of daily interaction. In East Asia, pipe smoking was adopted enthusiastically following contact with Portuguese traders in the 16th century. China, Japan, and other Asian societies adapted the practice to their own cultural forms. Different pipe designs, different rituals, different social meanings. But the underlying practice, imported from the Americas via Europe within decades of Columbus's voyage, took root everywhere it landed. Then came the 19th century, and the cigarette. The cigarette, paper-wrapped tobacco, is not as ancient as it sometimes seems. While paper-wrapped tobacco products existed in various forms earlier, the modern cigarette really takes shape in the mid-19th century, initially among soldiers. During the Crimean War, British soldiers picked up the habit from their Turkish allies, who had been rolling tobacco in paper for some time. The practice spread rapidly. What truly industrialized cigarette smoking, though, was a machine. In 1881, James Bonsack invented a mechanical cigarette rolling machine that could produce 120,000 cigarettes per day, the equivalent of what 40 hand rollers could do. This machine was licensed almost immediately by a young American tobacco businessman named James Buchanan Duke, who used it to dramatically undercut competitors and flood the market with cheap cigarettes. The price of cigarettes plummeted. Production skyrocketed. And the tobacco industry began the process of mass marketing, eventually including advertising campaigns, celebrity endorsements, and later some of the most spectacularly cynical corporate behavior in modern history. By the early 20th century, cigarette smoking was becoming normalized across the Western world. World War I massively accelerated this. Cigarettes were included in soldier ration packs, distributed free to troops by tobacco companies, and smoking rates among men skyrocketed. By the 1940s and 1950s, smoking was not just common. It was glamorous. Hollywood stars smoked on screen. Doctors appeared in cigarette advertisements. Cigarette brands competed to be endorsed by physicians. And then the research started coming in. The connection between smoking and lung cancer had been observed by individual physicians since at least the 1920s. But the definitive epidemiological evidence arrived in 1950, with two landmark studies published simultaneously. One by Richard Dahl and Austin Bradford Hill in the UK, one by Ernst Winder and Evarts Graham in the US. Both showed, with statistical clarity that was hard to dispute, that cigarette smokers had dramatically elevated rates of lung cancer. What happened next is one of the most disturbing stories in corporate history. The tobacco industry knew. Internal documents later obtained through litigation revealed that tobacco company researchers had independently confirmed the cancer link as early as the 1950s. The industry's response was not to warn the public. It was to fund studies designed to create doubt, to publicly dispute the science, to lobby against regulation, and to quietly market cigarettes to younger and younger audiences to replace customers who died. The playbook developed by the tobacco industry in the 1950s and 60s to fight scientific consensus about health risks became a template that has since been used by other industries facing similar threats. The fossil fuel industry's response to climate science, for instance, has been documented to follow almost exactly the same strategy. Historians of science sometimes call it the merchants of doubt approach, and its origins are in the tobacco industry's response to lung cancer research. The U.S. Surgeon General's landmark report on smoking and health came in 1964. Advertising restrictions followed over subsequent decades. Smoking rates in wealthy countries began to decline. Slowly at first, then more significantly. Today, smoking rates in countries like the US, UK, and Australia are at historic lows compared to their mid-20th century peaks. But globally, the picture is more complicated. While smoking rates have declined in wealthy countries, tobacco companies shifted their marketing focus to lower and middle income countries, where regulation was weaker and populations were younger. Today, the highest smoking rates in the world are found in countries across Asia, Eastern Europe, and parts of Africa. The global number of smokers remains over 1 billion. 1 billion people inhaling burning plant material deliberately every day. So let's come back to the original question, because we've traveled a long way and I want to make sure we land somewhere meaningful. When did ancient humans start smoking? If we mean inhaling smoke involuntarily from fire, the answer is essentially as long as humans have controlled fire. Possibly 1.5 million years. Possibly longer. If we mean burning aromatic plant materials in ritual or ceremonial contexts, inhaling smoke as part of spiritual practice, the evidence points back at least 10,000 years, possibly considerably further. If we mean intentionally smoking tobacco or other psychoactive plants through pipes or similar devices, the evidence in the Americas goes back at least 3,000 years and possibly much longer. If we mean smoking as a global mass behavior practiced across most cultures on most continents, that's a post-1492 phenomenon, roughly 500 years old. A blink, in the context of human history. But here's what I think is the most interesting takeaway from this entire story. Smoking, in its earliest forms, in its ritual origins, in the sacred tobacco traditions of the Americas and the incense-filled temples of the ancient world, was never really about the smoke. It was about reaching. It was about the persistent, universal human desire to get outside of ordinary consciousness, to touch something that can't normally be touched, to send something. Intention, prayer, grief, gratitude, somewhere beyond the material world. The smoke was a vehicle, a medium, a physical manifestation of something being offered or sought. And then, somewhere along the way, the ritual became habit. The sacred became commercial. The vehicle became the destination. The tobacco industry took something that had profound spiritual meaning for the people who first cultivated and used it, stripped that meaning away entirely, packaged it in paper and cellophane, and sold it by the trillion. Which is not to romanticize the health effects. Smoking kills people. Lung cancer, heart disease, stroke. The body count is staggering and ongoing. There's nothing romantic about that. But it is worth pausing to recognize what was lost in the translation. The indigenous peoples of the Americas who first developed these smoking traditions weren't addicted consumers of a corporate product. They were participants in a living, meaningful relationship with a plant that they considered sacred. A plant that connected them to their ancestors, to their gods, to the earth. That context got left behind somewhere in the 16th century, as tobacco sailed across the Atlantic in European ships and got turned into a commodity. And what remained? The smoke, the inhale, the brief neurochemical hit of nicotine has been repeating itself 1 billion times a day, ever since. Humans are remarkably consistent creatures. We found fire, we noticed smoke, we breathed it in, we found meaning in the act, we ritualized it, we traded it, we industrialized it, we got addicted to it, we got sick from it, we researched it, we regulated it. We're slowly, very slowly, moving away from it. And along every step of that journey, the fundamental drive underneath it all has remained the same. The desire to feel something, to reach somewhere, to alter, even briefly, the ordinary experience of being alive. That drive is as old as the campfire, as old as the shaman breathing smoke in the dark, as old as the ancient human who first noticed that some smoke did something to them, leaned in a little closer and thought, yes, more of that. We've been leaning in ever since.